what better way to start a talk on science than introduce you to Brian and Stewie from Family Guy. One of the episodes, they get this sort of time machine. It takes them to parallel universes, and they enter it. They find themselves in this futuristic city. There's flying cars, people are flying everywhere, and they go, wow, where on earth are we? But Stewie says, actually, we've gone nowhere. We're in the exact same place that we were before, and in the exact same time period that we were before. The only difference is, in this universe, Christianity never existed. So the 1,000-year Dark Ages were a time of technological advancements. So look at what the universe would look like without Christianity stamping all over science. If you spent any time on Reddit, you might be familiar with this idea. You have the Roman period, where brilliant education, brilliant philosophy, they started to get a slow development of the scientific method, and then the church came along. The church came along, stamped all of the scientific method away from the West, and we entered into this period of Dark Ages, right? Until the enlightened ones, the Enlightenment, you can see Dark Ages then to the enlightened ones, they came along and threw away the shackles of religion. You had secularism, and from secularism there rises the scientific method. It's a really cool story. The trouble is, it's pretty much a myth, and most historians today agree on that. What is described by the Redditors and by Family Guy is something that historians of science have called the conflict thesis. What the conflict thesis says is that the scientific method and Christianity have been at odds. But that's not really the case, and we're going to break that down. So the first thing we need to do is we need to ask the question, well, what even is science? What is the scientific method? I've got a couple of quotes up there which are quite long and wordy. But for today, when we refer to science, we're not necessarily referring to the ability to build bridges. Of course, that's scientific. We're not really referring to medicine. We're referring to systematic observations, where you test things in controlled situations to then make generalizations. You make theories about the world and what the world is like. So you take the test tube, and from the test tube you explore cause and effect, and from that you go to the wide theory about what the universe is like. That's the scientific method. It's important to pick up on the fact that the scientific method is very different to something called scientism. And a lot of the times in the discussion between Christianity and science, people are often talking about scientism, which is different to the scientific method. Scientism says that science is the only way to know things about the universe, or it's exclusive, it's the superior way of gaining knowledge. And that question was posed to Christian philosopher William Lane Craig in a debate with Peter Atkins, who's this brilliant chemist, really distinguished. He asked William Lane Craig, he says, surely you'd agree that science can account for everything we know of the universe? And William Lane Craig says, no, not at all. He brings 5 things that the scientific method can't demonstrate about the universe. You've got logical and mathematical truths. You don't look into a test tube and find the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction must exist for you to be able to do the scientific method. Same with mathematical truths. You've got metaphysical beliefs, things like other minds actually exist, things like there actually being an external reality. These are things that you need to assume to be able to do the scientific method. Ethical and moral judgments and beliefs, aesthetic judgments, the beautiful, and I think the final one is the Achilles heel of scientism. Well, the scientific method can't demonstrate its own veracity. You can't look into a test tube and be able to tell that the scientific method is true. You must need to assume first, for other reasons, that the scientific method is reliable, and then do the scientific method from that position. It's like it's really incoherent to say science is the only way of knowing true things about the universe, because that statement can't find a scientific basis or justification. So, as a Christian, I am someone who loves the scientific method. Not because it's the only way of getting knowledge about the universe. I believe loads of things that the scientific method can't demonstrate. I believe that everyone in this room has value, universal value, human value to every one of you. I can't cut open a human body and show you that. There's no experiment that I could do to tell you why you are valuable. I believe in an immaterial God, right? You don't go up into space and find something that's immaterial. These are things that you don't find in a microscope, a test tube, a telescope. But we can still have justifications for believing them. What I want to spend some time on now, so the basic thesis of this is that no, science has not killed God. The Christian worldview has given rise to the scientific method. And that is different to scientism. Scientism is opposed to Christianity, but the scientific method isn't. So going back to what we're talking about the conflict thesis, from Family Guy that says that there's been a suppression of the scientific method. The atheist historian, Tim O'Neill, he runs a page called History for Atheists. He says the only problem with this is that it's wrong. And historians have known this for about 100 years. He explains that the more reliable view of history is called the complexity thesis. Not that science and religion have been at odds with one another, but that they've had a complex relationship. So this is another quote from a book called Galileo Goes to Jail, and it basically says that today all historians agree that Christianity, Catholicism as well as Protestantism, moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically. So remember the definition I gave of the scientific method? That came out of Christian thinkers. And I want to spend a little bit of time sort of breaking that down now. I've got a book here. It's brilliant. I'm going to be leaning on this quite a lot. The Triumph of Christianity by Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark is not a Christian. He's a sociologist that tracks the history of Christianity. And he makes this claim. He says, there were no Dark Ages. There was no scientific revolution. Rather, the notion was invented to discredit the medieval church. So the enlightened ones created this myth that their light and before them is darkness. Really rhetorically powerful, but it can't find much basis in history. So a lot of people would say that Copernicus in the 15th century was the person that created the scientific revolution. But Rodney Stark argues that we didn't have a leap from darkness into the light. We had a slow evolution of scientific knowledge building up over time. So these three guys here are really important. Before Copernicus placed the sun at the center of the universe, these guys had already been doing the hard work behind closed doors. So you have William of Ockham in the middle in the 13th century. He predicted something akin to Newton's first law. He predicted that all of the planets in the universe will move they'll move continually because they're in a frictionless vacuum. This was different to the Greek view that believed that all of the planets were being moved by gods to overcome friction. That was a really important observation that he found. From that point, a guy called Nicolas Oresme, I'm sorry if anyone's French in here, I don't know how to pronounce it. He then claimed that the view that the Earth isn't moving and the Earth is the center is just it's an optical illusion. Actually, the universe is spinning, the universe is moving. That was something that wasn't believed previously. And then Copernicus built on these theories from these guys who were all in religious institutions. They were in the universities. Most of them were clergymen, in fact. They were Christians observing the world, and they were coming up with these theories. And then the scientific revolution was just building off these ideas. There's not much of a revolution taking place. It's more of an evolution. Yeah, what these guys lacked in haircuts, they made up for in swings and roundabouts, I guess. So yeah, next Thank you. Well, if any of you are familiar with this discussion, you're probably thinking, what about Galileo? Surely that proves that the church has always been contrary to the scientific method. I call him the conflict thesis flex tape, right? He's the hero of the plot. You have these holes in the narrative, and you get your flex tape, whack on Galileo, and there you go, problem solved. But there's a reason why they call it the complexity theory, because there was more going on than simple science versus God. The Indian philosopher Vishal Mangalwadi puts it this way. The church didn't execute scientists for their science. The conflicts were theological, moral, social, personal, political, or administrative. So Galileo was treated badly by the church. He came up with the view that the universe was not, the earth was not in the center of the universe, and some people took issue with it. Bearing in mind, there had already been these guys thinking similar things for a long time and building that theory up. But he's sort of the figurehead of it. But there's a lot more going on there than just, here's a brave scientist trying to remove the shackles of the church to move into secularism. And I want to point out three main sort of points about Galileo that will help us sort of recognize that. So, it was actually a tale of two egos. What's really interesting about Galileo is that he had a mean spirit about him. The Pope tried to suppress what he was teaching and writing. And what he did was, he said, can you just put this caveat into your writings? You can propagate these new scientific ideas, but put some caveats in there to sort of withhold, to stop the conflict. He did put those caveats in the text, but he put the caveats into the mouth of a guy called the simpleton, the fool, which is kind of a par, in that the simpleton, the Pope, the fool, was trying to get him to caveat his scientific inquiry, so Galileo publicly humiliated him. That's one of the reasons why he was treated badly. It wasn't necessarily science versus religion, it was ego versus ego, as often happens when someone's really powerful and they get mocked. It was a tale of two worldviews. One of the problems in the Catholic Church at the time was that they had this insistence of following what Plato and Aristotle said. It almost became the main assumption that, well, you must hold to Plato and Aristotle's view of cosmology, so that anything that comes counter to that is then problematic. Galileo didn't think that way. He had a different worldview. He saw the Bible as one of God's books and the universe and creation as another of God's books. In his eyes, Plato and Aristotle were not God's books. They were not to be put anywhere near to that position. And most of his rebellion was about their use of Plato and Aristotle. He wanted to remove like ancient ideas that weren't biblical from the church. It was also a tale of two churches. This affair was going on in post-Reformation times, where you just had this one splinter group come off, and the Reformers taught very different things to the Catholics, and a lot of them were put to death. The Pope was on high alert for new ideas at the time. There was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of angst about more splinters taking place, so they were very, very disconcerting of new ideas. So when you keep all of these factors in mind, is this simply the conflict thesis? Is this simply science opposing religion opposing science? Well, probably not, I would say. So I was really struck the other day when I was reading Oppenheimer. You know the guy they recently made the movie about? I was reading one of the lectures that he gave, and one of the things that really fascinated me was, as a secular Jew, he was wrestling with the fact that why on earth did the scientific method come out of Western Europe? The Islamic world empires had far more advanced mathematics. The Chinese cultures had far more advanced medicine and technology. There was more technologically advanced cultures. Why on earth was it the Christian West that gave rise to the scientific method? That's strange. Why was all of this taking place in the West? And the answer that he gave was that they discovered it in the Old Testament even as much as the New. And that's interesting. What on earth is he saying there? This seems to be counter what we hear about the scientific method, but actually he's saying that the scientific method is based on Christian assumptions about the universe. So we're going to break some of those down quickly. I've got 3 for us. Next slide. The first one is that God created a world that is orderly and comprehensible. So you got the quote here of Popes and Unicorns. Monotheism gave rise to the one cornerstone of modern science, the belief that an experiment conducted on a Monday will give results that is still usable on a Tuesday, since the same God is in total charge of the universe. Now, that might seem like an assumption that you all hold, that of course, the conditions today are going to be the same as tomorrow. But that's not actually being intuitive for most cultures. You have gods that are colliding with one another and fighting and wrestling. Which one's going to be sovereign over the axe in that day? Or there's just blind, pitiless chaos and indifference. Well, the scientific method is based on the assumption that the universe is uniform, and what happens today, if I'm to drop my notes, they're going to fall. And I know they're going to fall every single time. David Hume and Bertrand Russell really wrestled with this idea as well. They were thinking about this, and they said, well, how do I know? How do I actually know that if I drop something, it will fall? Well, it's always dropped and fallen, right? But then how do I know that the future will continue to resemble the past? Well, the future always has resembled the past. But no, that's the very thing I'm trying to discover, right? So they got themselves in this logical battle. And I think it was David Hume just said, I'm going to drink a cup of scotch and forget about this, because he didn't have an answer. But the reason why that isn't a problem for a Christian is that the monotheistic God is holding the universe up. Today will be the same as tomorrow. So we're also made in the image of that God. So there's a Christian belief that God has these attributes, and he communicates some of those attributes to us. Things like rationality, things like agency, things like consciousness. All of these things are communicated to us by God, which then means our cognitive faculties, our mental abilities, are reliable. You can see how that's important to the scientific method. There's a really interesting book here, The Rise of Early Modern Science. He charts the rise of science in Islam, China, and the West. It's fascinating. One of the things that he claims, I don't have it written down. So Kepler, the astrologist, he saw a connection between God's created world and the structure of God's mind that created the universe. So that means that human minds created in the image of God means that we can grasp the reality that's created by God's mind. So he says, human beings had the capacity to grasp the very nature of existence and God's laws. This medieval Christian belief has no analogy in Islamic or Chinese philosophical thought. This is a peculiarly Christian idea that the human mind is rational and we're able to study the universe. Again, it's something that we probably all take for a given. But why? Why would that be the case? If survival of the fittest is how our brains have evolved to be, then would our brains not be geared for survival rather than knowing truth, for example? This is a peculiarly Christian idea that gave rise to the scientific method. It motivated Kepler to make the great discoveries that he did. And finally, that leads me to sin, which is really interesting in a discussion about science. Why would sin be important? Well, as much as the human mind is rational and able to perceive the universe, Christians also believe that the human heart is broken. We deceive ourselves and we deceive others. We're not always honest. So if I came up with a theory about the universe, you all know that I make mistakes, and I would want to make mistakes at times to propagate whatever idea. So what you would all probably do is you would test it. If there's a problem of human sin, then you test the claims that people make, because people lie. So in this book, Galilei Goes to Jail Again, he says that one of the things that catalyzed the scientific method is the Augustinian idea of something called original sin, that we're born with a sin problem. We're born with the propensity to make mistakes and do things that are wrong. That was embraced by advocates of experimental natural philosophy, science. So they saw that fallen humans lack the grace to understand the workings of the world through their cognition alone. So this separates Christian thinkers from the Greek thinkers. The Greek thinkers would ponder the universe and come up with these wild and abstract theories because they loved the human mind and they thought the human mind was brilliant and rational. Christians thought that, but on the other side of the coin, they knew that human minds need to be tested. Aristotle was famous for not testing things. He said that a heavier ball would fall at a quicker rate than a lighter ball. If he'd ever done a test, he would know that that wasn't true. That was something that was believed for a long time, until people realised that it's actually air resistance is what makes objects fall at different rates. Aristotle wasn't interested in doing the scientific method because what he thought was correct and true. His mind was rational. He didn't have the same notion of sin. So yeah, I realised we've gone over a lot in a not very long period of time. But I guess the final thought to end with is that I don't want to stand up here and say Christianity is this nice set of ideas that has influenced the world. I think it is that, but I think it's more than that, because we don't just have a set of ideas. There is a story to the development of the scientific method. There is this kind of myth that we can believe and hold to, and that makes the universe make sense. But the interesting and peculiar Christian view is that myth kind of stepped into human history. The story that defines us is what it has made himself known. How on earth could you call a story him? That doesn't make sense. But Jesus calls himself truth. He says, I am the truth. So then we're not just discussing abstract ideas here. Truth is immaterial, yet makes himself known, comes to us. And that's why we put on things like an events week, because we want people to know truth, not just true ideas like how science came to be, but truth himself. And the Christian claim is that this isn't just a myth, it's the one myth that was acted out in human history. If Jesus really died, really rose from the dead, then it's not just that the universe makes sense, it's that we have something to point to that demonstrates that truth. So yeah, I've recommended a few books. Do come and have a look. There's a couple that I have to give away. There's also a great YouTuber called Inspiring Philosophy who has done loads of work on this topic, which is really accessible. But yeah, come to all the rest of the events, take an Uncover Luke. But yeah, thank you very much for having me.